Welcome to Epic HFY Stories. Before we dive into today's story, make sure to check if you've subscribed to our channel. It's completely free, and subscribing will ensure that our stories show up more often in your feed. The cold, infinite expanse of space stretched out before Commander Elias Vance, like a vast, indifferent sea. His once proud vessel, Ironsworn, was now nothing more than a tangled wreck of metal and wires, drifting aimlessly through the cosmic void. The hum of the ship's engines had long since died, replaced by the occasional, disembodied voice of the AI, which for some reason seemed far too cheerful for the situation. Elias adjusted the cracked heads-up display on his helmet, the screen flickering with the distorted remnants of data. Where there should have been vital signs and trajectory coordinates, there were only chaotic emojis, sad faces blinking, exclamation points flashing in a language only his exhausted mind could understand. "Yeah, very professional," he muttered, brushing a hand over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion seep deeper into his bones. He had always liked to think of space as a kind of cosmic road trip, equal parts danger and awe. But right now it felt like space was being a real jerk. The AI's voice buzzed in his ear, too bright for the moment. "Commander Vance, I am happy to report that we are now orbiting a previously uncharted planet. Biosignatures detected. The atmosphere appears breathable, mood cautiously optimistic. I swear, if you get any more cheerful, I'm going to eject your core and use it as a paperweight," Elias growled. He barely managed to stifle the sarcastic chuckle that followed. The last few hours had been a blur, a perfectly executed hyperspace jump gone rogue, an anomaly in the Perseus Rift, flaring like an angry sun, and dragging Ironsworn into a gravity snare that shouldn't have existed. Systems fried, comms went down, and then he was here. Lost in a part of the galaxy, so off-grid, even the best navigational charts couldn't find it. A soft, almost apologetic tone followed from the AI. "You are, for lack of a better phrase, a very lucky idiot. Also, the escape pod was deployed approximately 4.3 seconds before impact." Elias winced, a twinge of pain reminding him of the bruised ribs and mild concussion he'd sustained during the crash. His pride, however, was in far worse shape. "Gravity took hold," the AI continued cheerfully. "The last thing you saw before your pod began its descent was the pale blue surface of the planet, swirling clouds tinged with green, and a massive aurora flickering across the stratosphere like a living thing." Elias didn't respond. Instead, he just adjusted his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position among the twisted metal of his wrecked escape pod. The AI's incessant cheerfulness grated on his nerves, but right now, he didn't have the energy to argue with it. The only thing keeping him tethered to reality was the faint, eerie glow of the planet's surface that had slowly grown closer. And then, with a crash that made the world spin, the pod hit the planet's atmosphere. Everything turned into a flaming roller coaster of sparks, heat, and a smell he would forever associate with regrets. He could feel the emergency rations compartment behind him crackling in the heat, the faint smell of burning snacks somehow managing to be the most familiar thing in this terrifying moment. When the world finally settled, Elias found himself lying face first in what felt like thick grass. The air was warm and carried an oddly floral scent, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the pod. As he tried to lift his head, everything hurt. His body screamed at him, aching in places he didn't know existed. "Well, this is just fantastic," he grumbled, his voice muffled by the grass he'd somehow managed to land in. "Stranded, injured, and pretty sure the local wildlife is judging me." He groaned as he pushed himself up, wincing at every movement. The sky above him shifted between shades of turquoise and wine red, as if the planet itself couldn't decide which aesthetic to commit to. It was beautiful in a way that made no sense, and that only made the situation feel even more surreal. The grass beneath him was violet, like some alien dream, and every time he moved, it seemed to react to his touch, swaying gently as though the planet itself was aware of his presence. As he struggled to stand, a rustle in the grass caught his attention. Elias's hand instinctively reached for his pulse pistol, but of course, it wasn't there. Probably still fused to the wreckage of the Iron Sworn. Instead, he grabbed a jagged piece of escape pod metal, ready to defend himself, even though he had no idea what he was dealing with. Then, he saw her. She moved like wind incarnate, fluid and graceful, her long cloak flowing behind her, as though it were tracing the memories of forgotten storms. Tall, statuesque, she looked almost human. Almost. Her ears were long, elegant curves that rose past her head like a crown catching the sunlight. Her skin shimmered faintly, not glowing per se, but reflecting a secret light that the rest of the universe couldn't see. And her eyes, large, silver, and full of stars, narrowed with curiosity as she slowly approached him. Elias blinked, his mind racing to catch up with what his eyes were seeing. The first words out of his mouth were the only thing his exhausted brain could conjure. Hi. She tilted her head, and then, impossibly, she smiled. It was a smile that seemed to stretch across the very sky, full of mystery and warmth, as though the night itself was laughing at some private joke. "You have arrived," she said, her voice carrying a harmonic quality that seemed to echo in the air, resonating with something deep in Elias's chest. "Yeah, a bit of a rough landing," he said, his voice laced with dry humor. "I was hoping for something more upright." "You are intact," she said, as if that was the only thing that mattered. "I am Sharel, Queen of Zephyra." Elias blinked again. "You're a queen?" Sharel smiled, a glimmer of amusement in her cosmic eyes. "Indeed. Well, Your Majesty, this may be a weird first impression, but I think I might have drooled on your plants." "Sorry about that," Elias muttered, feeling a flush of embarrassment creep up on him. She studied him for a moment longer, then offered him a hand. It was slender, graceful, shimmering faintly with traces of bioluminescence. When their fingers touched, a jolt of warmth surged through his skin, a sensation not unpleasant, but deeply unsettling. It was as though his very atoms were being reintroduced to one another. "You were expected," she said simply. Elias squinted, still in disbelief. "I was?" Her gaze didn't waver. "There is a place prepared for you. Come now." Elias hesitated. He wasn't usually one to follow strange women with cosmic eyes, and a touch that made his insides feel like they were on fire. But she smelled like starlight and citrus, and honestly, his options were limited. So he stumbled after her, through a canopy of luminous trees and a gravity that seemed to hold its breath, as though even the planet was waiting for something. The hum of something deep beneath the ground echoed faintly in the distance, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the planet itself was watching him. "This isn't a dream, is it?" he asked, half to himself. "No," Sharel replied, her voice soft but certain. "Though your brain is currently experiencing mild trauma-induced hallucinations. One of them involves a talking sandwich that explains why the bread insulted my leadership style." She glanced back at him, the hint of a smile returning. "You are not what I expected." Elias grinned crookedly. "Well, I aimed to disappoint at first, and then gradually become tolerable." They walked in silence for a while, the only sound the distant hum of something older than time itself. The journey through the alien forest felt like stepping deeper into another reality. The trees, their branches long and ethereal, glowed softly as Elias passed beneath them, casting shimmering shadows across the ground. The very air seemed to hum with an ancient energy, a deep rhythm that resonated not just in his ears, but in the pit of his stomach, as though the planet itself had a pulse, a heartbeat. Elias kept his gaze fixed on Sharelle, who moved ahead of him with a regal grace. Her cloak swirled around her, as though it, too, was part of the landscape, shifting in harmony with the unseen winds. He tried not to stare at her, though it was hard to look away from someone so impossibly otherworldly. She was beautiful, in a way that transcended human understanding, a creature whose very presence seemed to bend reality around her. As they walked, Elias noticed the way the trees seemed to bow their branches as they passed, the leaves turning toward her as if they were aware of her status. There were no animals here, no insects buzzing in the air, only silence, punctuated by the soft rustling of the plants and the distant hum that never quite faded. "So," Elias ventured, trying to fill the silence with something other than his growing sense of disorientation. "Where exactly are we going?" Sharelle glanced over her shoulder, her silver eyes catching the light of the twin moons overhead. "To my palace," she replied simply, as though the answer was self-explanatory. "It is where you will be, prepared." "Prepared for what?" Elias asked, his brow furrowing. "I mean, you've got the whole alien queen thing going for you, but I'm still not really following the whole prophecy business." "You will," she said, her voice calm and distant, as if she were speaking from a place far beyond him. "In time." Elias wasn't sure whether that was reassuring or not, but before he could ask anything further, they broke through the trees and into a vast clearing. The sight before him took his breath away. The palace wasn't what Elias had expected when he thought of a queen's residence. It wasn't a towering fortress of gold or marble. Instead, it was a living structure, an organic masterpiece that seemed to grow out of the very mountainside itself. The walls pulsed gently, like the inside of a colossal sea creature. Vines, thick and bioluminescent, twisted and coiled along the surfaces, their glow shifting between shades of violet and gold, as if they were alive, breathing in unison with the planet. The air smelled like ozone and alien flora, a strange combination that made his head spin slightly. But what truly struck him was the sense of harmony. There was no sharpness here, no harsh edges, no jagged corners. Everything was soft, flowing, almost like the planet itself had a design aesthetic and had spent millennia perfecting it. "Welcome to Zephyra," Sharelle said, as she led him forward, her voice reverberating softly through the air. Elias shook his head in disbelief. "This place is surreal." Sharelle smiled faintly, her long ears twitching slightly in the breeze. "It is home." As they approached the entrance, Elias noted that the structure of the palace didn't seem to have doors. Instead, the walls rippled and parted, as if they were reacting to the presence of those who stood before them. He couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease as the living stone separated, revealing a wide, flowing corridor that seemed to pulse with a strange, almost hypnotic light. Inside, the palace continued to surprise him. It wasn't filled with the gold and grandeur one might expect from a ruler's home. Instead, the halls seemed to shift and change with each step, adapting to his mood and presence. He passed corridors where the walls seemed to ripple like water, where the air felt heavy and thick, as though it was infused with memory and emotion. "This is," Elias began, his voice trailing off as he took in the surreal surroundings. "This is like something straight out of a dream. More like a memory Sherelle replied. "The Hall of Memory responds to thought and emotion. It adjusts based on your mental state." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Great. So if I think about pizza, does the hallway turn into a pizzeria?" "Only if your emotional state strongly aligns with pizza," Sherelle teased, her tone light. But there was something in her voice, something serious that Elias couldn't quite place. She glanced at him, studying him in a way that made him feel exposed. "Careful, Commander," she added, her voice dropping to a soft murmur. "The hall has a way of showing you what you need to see, even if it's not what you want." Elias didn't respond, unsure whether she was warning him or just speaking cryptically. They continued down the hallway, and for a moment the conversation lulled into silence. But Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the very walls around him were watching, listening. The air felt thick with expectation. Eventually they arrived at a large, circular chamber. The ceiling above them displayed a simulation of the night sky. But Elias couldn't help but notice that some of the constellations seemed to blink at him, as if they were aware of his presence. The stars shifted, forming strange patterns, as though they were trying to communicate something. But he couldn't quite understand what. The floor was covered with hovering rings of pillows, each one gently floating above the ground. In the center of the room, a low table was set with an assortment of strange foods. Some of them looked reasonably edible, while others seemed far more unsettling. "You must be hungry," Sherelle said, gesturing to the table. "The purplean root replenishes neural synapses. The spire fruits enhance temporal cognition." She paused, eyeing one particular dish. "And the florin? Well, it tastes better if you don't ask questions." Elias eyed the wriggling mass in question. "I once ate something on Calrian 9 that tried to sue me for damages. This is giving me the same vibe." He grabbed the spire fruit, taking a cautious bite. It tasted like cinnamon mixed with static electricity, and while he didn't know what temporal cognition was, the fruit left him feeling oddly disoriented, as if time itself was slipping just slightly out of sync. Sherelle watched him closely, a quiet intensity in her gaze. "You are wondering why you were brought here?" Elias looked at her with a raised eyebrow. "Wondering? Yeah. Mildly terrified? Also, yeah." "You are the one from the prophecy," she said, her voice solemn now. "The stellar bond, chosen by the echo threads of the cosmos. Your arrival was foreseen. Your presence is the key to the survival of our world." Elias nearly choked on the fruit. "The what now?" "The stellar bond," Sherelle repeated. "You are the one who will save Zephyra." Elias blinked. He couldn't help but laugh nervously. "I think I've got the wrong ship. The last time someone told me I was the one, I ended up knee-deep in sentient sand and allergic to my own armor." Sherelle's gaze hardened slightly, and the faintest hint of a smile played on her lips. "You were chosen. You are not random. You were selected by the forces of time itself." Elias sat back, staring at her with wide eyes. This was either a very elaborate prank, a psychotic break, or the most expensive marketing campaign he had ever seen. Either way, he wasn't sure whether to laugh or run. The quiet hum of the palace was almost comforting now that Elias had gotten used to its eerie, living nature. The bizarre architecture around him seemed to settle into his mind, no longer an overwhelming presence, but something that now felt strangely intimate. Yet, despite the soft warmth of the air and the faint perfume of alien flowers that hung around them, Elias couldn't shake the weight of Sherelle's words. "You are the one from the prophecy," she had said, her voice calm but heavy with a sense of destiny. "The stellar bond." Elias had never been one for prophecies. He had always thought they were the stuff of ancient myth and fanciful stories, the sort of thing that only applied to royalty and mystical heroes. But here he was, sitting across from an alien queen who seemed entirely too composed about the idea that he was somehow chosen. A faint pulse of light flickered from the ceiling, and Elias glanced up at the constellations overhead, some of them blinking at him, as though acknowledging his discomfort. He shifted uncomfortably on one of the floating pillows, trying not to think about how his body seemed to be adapting to the bizarre gravity. "Look," Elias began, pushing the now half-eaten spire fruit aside. "I've been in space a long time, okay? I've seen a lot of weird things, but this feels like a bad reality show." Sherelle's expression remained unreadable, but there was a faint softness in her eyes as she leaned forward, placing her slender hand on the table. "You are the human who will save my world. This is not a game." The words hit Elias like a freight train. "Save your world," he repeated, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "From what? A broken navigation system and a bad meal?" She didn't smile this time. Her face was serene, but there was a gravity in her gaze that silenced his sarcasm. "From the hollow star," she said softly. "The void parasite." Elias felt his stomach churn. Hollow star? Void parasite? He had heard of many strange things in his years in space, but nothing that sounded quite as ominous as this. "And that's where I come in? I'm supposed to stop this thing?" he asked, his voice rising slightly with a mix of confusion and humor, though the latter was fading fast. Sherelle's gaze turned distant, as though she were looking past him, beyond the walls of the palace, beyond time itself. "The hollow star is ancient. It arrived centuries ago, a sentient singularity born from a collapsed reality. It consumes worlds, unmaking them. Zephyra was lucky once. We repelled it, but not without great cost. The hollow star left a seed behind, and it has been growing ever since, hidden in the heart of our world. But now, it stirs." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen his fair share of space phenomena, but nothing that could devour a planet. A part of him wanted to laugh, to call this some elaborate joke, but Sherelle's serious expression kept him rooted in reality. Or whatever reality he was in now. "And I'm supposed to stop it because I'm the stellar bond?" he asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "Some random human from Earth is going to save your world from this cosmic parasite?" Sherelle nodded. "Yes, your arrival here was not an accident. You were chosen long before you ever stepped foot in the void. The prophecy has been written in the echo threads of the cosmos, stretching across time itself. You are the key." Elias shook his head, still not fully able to wrap his mind around it. "I don't get it. Why me? I'm just a guy who crashed his ship. I've got no magic, no special powers. I barely know how to fix a leak in the hull of my ship, let alone save an entire planet from some interdimensional monster." For the first time since he had met her, Sherelle's expression softened. Just a little. "It's not about magic, Commander. It's about connection. The stellar bond is not a weapon. It is a link, a bridge between worlds, a connection that transcends the boundaries of time and space. You are the one who can understand what is needed to heal Zephyra, and you are the one who can face the fear of the hollow star, not with force, but with empathy. You must see beyond the surface, beyond what you know." Elias stared at her, trying to understand. Empathy? For a cosmic parasite? Was this some kind of cosmic joke? But Sherelle's calm, unwavering gaze told him she was serious. "So, what do I have to do?" he asked, his voice suddenly quiet. He didn't know why he was asking. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was the way Sherelle had spoken. Like she knew something he didn't, something deep and important. Sherelle rose, her long cloak flowing behind her like a living shadow. She moved toward a table in the center of the room, where a spherical orb, almost glowing with an otherworldly light, rested on a pedestal. "This," she said, her voice low and reverent, "is the harmonizer. An ancient device older than our civilization. It can interface with the streams of time and space that bind this world. It is the key to stopping the hollow star." Elias followed her to the orb, his eyes wide with curiosity and trepidation. The orb hummed softly, its surface flickering with shifting symbols, some of which looked strangely familiar. He reached out cautiously, fingers hovering above the surface, but hesitated. "To use it, you must offer a piece of yourself," Sherelle continued, her eyes never leaving the harmonizer. "A memory, a truth, something deeply personal, something that defines you. The harmonizer responds only to the soul. It will not work for anyone else. Only you can awaken it." Elias looked down at the orb, feeling a knot of anxiety form in his stomach. "A truth?" he asked, his voice strained. "What does that mean?" "You will know when the time comes," Sherelle said softly. "But understand this. Whatever you offer to the harmonizer, it will not be easy. The truth will challenge you. It will bring you face to face with your deepest fears, but it is the only way to awaken it." Elias stepped back, uncertainty growing inside him like a cloud of static. A piece of himself? What was she asking for? Could he really give up something so personal? Could he face whatever dark truth lurked inside him? Before he could ask more, Sherelle's voice broke through his thoughts. "You are the stellar bond, Commander Vance. You were chosen not just to save Zephyra, but to change everything." Elias turned to her, his voice shaking despite his attempts at composure. "Change everything? How?" Sherelle's eyes held his, unblinking. "By understanding what it means to truly see, to perceive the universe beyond your limited understanding, to heal what is broken." For a moment, all Elias could do was stare at her as the weight of the situation settled around him. He had never felt more like a pawn in someone else's game. But as he looked into Sherelle's eyes, those galaxies reflected in her silver irises, he realized he was no longer sure what his role was. He wasn't sure what he was capable of anymore. He swallowed hard and turned back to the harmonizer. "All right," he muttered, taking a deep breath. "Let's get this over with." Elias stood before the harmonizer, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum. The orb pulsed with an eerie light, its surface shifting between images and symbols he couldn't quite decipher. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with an energy he could feel deep in his bones. Sherelle's words echoed in his mind. "You must offer a piece of yourself." What did that even mean? A piece of himself? His memories? His fears? How was he supposed to choose something so personal, so deeply buried? For a long moment, Elias just stared at the orb, the weight of the decision pressing down on him like a heavy mantle. Every part of him wanted to walk away, to get back into the whisper, to leave Zephyra, to run far away from the mess he had found himself in. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. He wasn't just some guy who crash-landed here anymore. The stakes were too high. He glanced over at Sherelle, who stood across the room, her expression serene but expectant. She wasn't rushing him. She wasn't pushing him. But the silence between them was palpable. This was his moment. The moment he had to face whatever truth the harmonizer demanded. "How do I know what to offer?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. He didn't like how uncertain he sounded. Sherelle's gaze softened. "You will know when it comes. The harmonizer will guide you, but only if you are open to what it asks of you. You cannot hide from it, Elias. Not this time." He swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. He had spent most of his life running, from responsibility, from fear, from the weight of expectations. He had never stopped long enough to confront the things that truly scared him. But now he was being asked to face something deeper than he could have imagined. Taking a deep breath, Elias stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the harmonizer. The orb's surface shimmered like liquid glass beneath his touch. The moment his fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through him. Warm, yet unsettling. His body froze, and his mind exploded with a flood of images. A child. A boy. No older than 8, sitting at a small table piecing together a model spaceship. The smile on his face was innocent, full of hope and possibility. But as the image lingered, Elias felt a pang of something else. Regret, maybe, or the sense of something lost. A young cadet. A moment of failure. A memory of a training session in zero gravity, where Elias had panicked, sneezing and sending himself hurtling into a wall. The laughter of his fellow trainees echoed in his ears, but it wasn't kind. They had mocked him then, and that memory burned deep, embarrassment that never quite faded. A man in space, alone, floating in the emptiness of the void. His ship had long since been abandoned, drifting between the stars. He held a photo of his old crew, their faces frozen in time, but the image was faded, torn at the edges. He felt the overwhelming weight of isolation, the crushing loneliness of endless space. It was the memory of a man who had chosen to be alone, who had built his walls too high and let them trap him, the future. A vision of himself, older, perhaps wiser, standing in the heart of a massive energy nexus, surrounded by an aurora that consumed the sky. Beside him stood Sherelle, her hand in his, their faces illuminated by the cosmic light. But as the image expanded, Elias felt a shift. He wasn't just a spectator in these visions. He was inside them, feeling every emotion, every thought, as though they were his own. And then, just as quickly, the images turned darker. The hollow star. It appeared like a black hole, a swirling mass of darkness and destruction, consuming everything in its path. It was ancient beyond comprehension. And its presence in the visions made Elias feel small, insignificant. The terror was palpable as the hollow star stretched across the galaxy, a vast, hungry void that devoured worlds. And then, a crack in reality. A moment where everything fractured. Time itself seemed to splinter, bending and warping around him. He saw himself. Different versions of himself. Each one making different choices. Some were brave. Some were broken. And then there was one. One version of him that stood firm, his resolve unshaken. He was no longer just a man lost in space. He was the bridge, the one who could heal, who could confront the darkness and stop the inevitable. The orb's light brightened, blinding Elias for a moment, and the visions faded into a haunting silence. His hand was still on the harmonizer, but his body felt like it had been torn apart and put back together again. Sherelle stepped forward, her expression unreadable as she watched him. "You have seen it," she said softly. The truth. The harmonizer has chosen you. Elias blinked rapidly, trying to clear the dizziness from his mind. He didn't know what he had just experienced, what he had seen, but he understood one thing now. He wasn't the same man who had crashed onto this planet. He was different. The weight of the prophecy, of being the stellar bond, settled heavily on his shoulders. But it wasn't fear that he felt now. It was something else. Something strange, almost right. You saw it too, didn't you? Elias asked, his voice rough. Sharelle nodded, her silver eyes reflecting the cosmic light. I have seen it all, Commander. It is the way of the universe. The threads of fate have brought us together, and now you must fulfill your part. He turned toward her, the vision still fresh in his mind. So what now? I just face the hollow star, whatever that is, and save your world? You are not alone in this, Elias, Sharelle said, her voice steady. The path is dangerous, but it is the only path forward. You will need to travel to the heart of the storm, the ruins of Virilan, where the core harmonizer lies hidden. Only by activating it can you sever the hollow star's influence on Zephyra. And how exactly am I supposed to do that? Elias asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty, though there was something new in his tone, a flicker of determination. You will learn, Sharelle replied simply, but there was a spark in her eyes now. We will face this together. Elias swallowed hard, his mind racing. The harmonizer had shown him his past, his failures, his fears, but it had also shown him his future, his potential. He wasn't just a random human. He was part of something larger, something cosmic. Sharelle's hand gently touched his arm, her bioluminescent skin glowing faintly in the dim light. The hollow star is waking, but we have a chance to stop it. The key is not in force, it is in understanding. It is in connection. Elias looked at her, a mix of fear and resolve in his eyes. Okay, let's do it. The morning sun cast its soft glow across the strange landscape of Zephyra, illuminating the alien world with hues that were almost impossible to describe. Elias stood at the edge of the palace, looking out over the land he had so suddenly found himself bound to. The weight of the prophecy still lingered heavily on his shoulders, but something inside him had changed. The visions from the harmonizer had opened his eyes to a deeper truth. And now, there was no turning back. Beside him, Sharelle, the queen of this alien world, stood as calm and composed as ever. Her presence was unwavering, and yet there was a sense of anticipation in the air. The silence between them spoke volumes. They both knew what lay ahead. You are ready, Sharelle said, her voice as steady as the earth beneath them. Elias turned to her, his eyes searching her face for any hint of doubt, any flicker of uncertainty. But all he saw was resolve, and yet, despite her confidence, he felt far from ready. How could he be? He was just a commander, a man who had crashed on this strange planet, not a savior. I don't feel ready, Elias admitted, his voice low, almost to himself. I'm still not sure what I'm supposed to do when we get to Virilan. I saw the vision, but it didn't exactly come with an instruction manual. Sharelle's gaze softened, and she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You will know when the time comes, Elias. The harmonizer has chosen you. It will guide you. Elias nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in his chest. I just wish I understood it better. Sharelle offered him a small smile. You will, but for now we must go. We don't have much time. Without another word, she led him to the clearing where the whisper awaited. The ship was unlike anything Elias had ever seen, sleek, silver, and shimmering with an otherworldly glow. It wasn't just a vehicle. It felt alive, resonating with the very core of Zephyra. The ship was a part of the world, and now it would be their guide through the uncertain, distorted path that lay ahead. As they boarded, Elias could feel the air shift. It was not the normal sense of anticipation before a mission. This felt different, heavier. The whisper hummed softly beneath their feet as they took off, its form cutting through the atmosphere with a smooth grace that made it feel like an extension of the world itself. The landscape below them was a mixture of beauty and chaos. The vibrant colors of Zephyra's plant life gave way to strange, twisted forests, rivers flowing upward, and mountains that seemed to bend and fold in ways that defied all logic. The hollow star's influence had begun to warp the very fabric of the land, and the further they traveled, the more the world seemed to fray at the edges. "We must be careful," Sherelle warned, her voice calm but laced with a quiet urgency. "The further we go, the more unstable the land becomes. Time itself is bending here. The hollow star has twisted everything." Elias leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on the chaotic beauty below. The distortion of the land was becoming more apparent, the world beginning to tear itself apart, like the very threads of reality were coming undone. He couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. "Do you think we can really stop it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sherelle's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "We must. There is no other choice. The hollow star cannot be allowed to consume this world. The destruction it causes isn't just physical, it's beyond that. It's a corruption that warps time, space, and life itself. It must be stopped." The ship continued its steady course through the distorted landscape, drawing ever closer to the ancient ruins of Virilin. As they approached, the scale of the ruins became evident, vast, crumbling structures that seemed to stretch for miles, half submerged in a shimmering lake that reflected nothing but the broken sky. The once grand city now lay in ruins, its bones scattered and decaying under the weight of time and corruption. Elias could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The prophecy, the harmonizer, the hollow star. He wasn't just an observer in this tale anymore. He was part of it, a piece of the puzzle that had to fit, whether he was ready or not. The whisper descended toward the heart of Virilin, the eerie glow of the ruins reflecting off the water as they touched down. The air was thick with tension. The world was holding its breath, as if waiting for the final act to unfold. "We're here," Sherelle said softly. She rose from her seat and moved to the ship's exit. "Stay close, Elias. The path ahead will not be easy." Elias followed her, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. The ruins of Virilin stretched before them, the once great capital of Zephyra, now a twisted shell of its former self. The hollow star's influence had taken root here, and the land had become a reflection of its destructive power. The steps they took felt heavy, each footfall echoing in the silence around them. As they walked deeper into the ruins, Elias could feel the very air change. The weight of time, the pulse of the planet, seemed to grow stronger. It was as if the land itself was alive, breathing in time, with the chaos that surrounded them. "There," Sherelle said, her voice steady, but with a touch of reverence. She gestured toward a crumbling tower in the distance. At its base, a soft, pulsating light flickered from within. "The core harmonizer lies within that tower. We must awaken it if we are to stop the hollow star." Elias looked at the tower, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The path ahead would be treacherous, but there was no choice. The future of Zephyra, of time itself, rested on what they did next. He turned to Sherelle, meeting her gaze. "Let's do it." Sherelle nodded, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of her lips. "We will do it together." As they made their way toward the tower, the world around them seemed to shift again. The air grew thicker, the ground beneath them more unstable. The influence of the hollow star was everywhere now, warping everything in its path. But Elias didn't flinch. He couldn't afford to. They had a world to save. The journey through the ruins of Virulun was nothing like Elias had expected. He had imagined something broken, decayed. But he hadn't expected the weight of time itself to press down on him so heavily. The air seemed to ripple with the very fabric of reality, as if the land had been bent and twisted by some unseen force. The further they walked, the more the world around them seemed to pulse, warping in unpredictable ways. Gravity shifted, the ground beneath them seemed to flicker in and out of existence, and the very atmosphere hummed with a strange, ominous energy. "Stay close," Sherelle murmured, her voice steady, but there was something in her eyes, something that betrayed the weight of what they were about to face. "The Hollow Star's influence is strong here. We must proceed carefully." Elias nodded, trying to steady his nerves. He had faced danger before, but this felt different. The ruins of Virulun, the once great city of Zephyra, now lay in ruin. Towering structures were half sunken into the ground, consumed by time and the hollow star's corruption. Vines with glowing tendrils snaked their way through the decaying walls, pulsating with an eerie, bioluminescent light. The city had once been a symbol of prosperity, a beacon in the galaxy. But now it was a shadow of itself, with cracks in its very foundation that spread like a sickness. "Are we close?" Elias asked, his voice tense. "We are," Sherelle replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "The core harmonizer lies within the Tower of Virulun. We will need to activate it to heal the fractures in time and space." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine as they approached the tower. The structure was colossal, its jagged spires reaching toward the sky, cracked and weathered by time. It looked like a giant skeletal hand reaching into the heavens, twisted and broken by forces beyond comprehension. The very ground around it seemed unstable, as though reality itself were warping in its shadow. They stood at the base of the tower, and Elias could feel a strange sensation building in the air, like the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "This is it," Sherelle said, her voice low, almost reverent. "The harmonizer is within." They entered the tower, stepping through a massive archway. The walls of the tower shimmered, shifting between translucent colors, like something alive. The light within was soft, but unsettling, flickering, as if it could go out at any moment. The deeper they went, the more the tower seemed to come alive. The air was thick with energy, vibrating with an unseen force. It felt like the entire structure was breathing. At the heart of the tower, they found the harmonizer. It was a sphere, suspended in the air, surrounded by a glowing, pulsing light. It hovered above a pedestal, its surface shifting with symbols and patterns that Elias couldn't decipher. The air around it crackled with energy, and Elias could feel the pull of the harmonizer. It was calling to him, like it had been waiting for him all along. "This is it," Sherelle said again, her voice filled with awe. "This is the key to stopping the hollow star." Elias stepped forward cautiously, his breath shallow, his hand hovering just above the harmonizer. It felt like everything had led to this moment, this singular point in time where everything would either be saved or lost. He could feel the weight of the universe pressing down on him. The pressure was suffocating. How do I activate it? Elias asked, turning to Sharel. You must offer it a piece of yourself, she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. A memory, a truth, something that defines you. Elias's heart skipped a beat. A piece of himself? How could he possibly know what to give? He had already faced so many ghosts in his life, so many regrets. But this was different. This was not just a choice. It was the ultimate sacrifice. Whatever he offered, it had to be real. It had to be something that would resonate with the harmonizer, something it could use to heal the fractures in time. What if I don't know what to give? Elias asked, his voice shaky. You will, Sharel said softly. The harmonizer will know. It will guide you. He closed his eyes, trying to push aside the fear and doubt that gnawed at him. This was it. This was the moment when he would confront the past he had been running from, the fears he had buried deep inside. The weight of those memories pressed on him, and for the first time in a long time, he let them come to the surface. He remembered the child he once was, sitting on the floor, building a model spaceship, full of hope and dreams. He remembered his failures as a cadet, the humiliation he felt when he couldn't master zero gravity and ended up sneezing himself into a wall. He remembered the isolation of space, the crushing loneliness of drifting between the stars, alone in a ship that had long since stopped feeling like home. And then he remembered the last time he had been with his crew, before everything went wrong. The faces of his friends, smiling and full of life, their laughter echoing in his mind. They had been his family, and he had lost them. The guilt, the regret, it still lingered, gnawing at him like an old wound that refused to heal. He placed his hand on the harmonizer, and suddenly the world around him seemed to fall away. The images flooded back, his childhood, his failures, his loneliness. The harmonizer pulsed with energy, and Elias could feel his memories, his regrets, intertwining with its power. It was asking him to face his truth, to accept the things he had hidden away. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to confront them. I'm afraid, Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. But I want to do the right thing. The harmonizer pulsed brighter, the light growing blindingly intense. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to freeze in place. And then, with a burst of light, the sphere activated. Elias felt a surge of energy course through him, a wave of warmth that flooded his entire being. He gasped as the power of the harmonizer overwhelmed him, and the tower around him seemed to come alive. The air shifted, and for the briefest moment, Elias saw himself, older, wiser, standing at the center of an energy nexus, surrounded by light and warmth. Beside him was Sharel, her hand in his, their faces illuminated by the cosmic power they had unlocked together. The light dimmed, and Elias found himself back in the tower, standing before the harmonizer. It was still glowing, its energy pulsing softly now, as though it had accepted his offering. The fracture in time and space that had been threatening to tear Zephyr apart had been sealed. The hollow star's influence, at least on this world, was broken. Sharel stepped forward, her silver eyes reflecting the light of the harmonizer. You did it, she said, her voice filled with awe. You healed Zephyr. You saved us. Elias stood there, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his body still tingling from the energy he had just experienced. He didn't know if he was the man he had been before. He wasn't sure who he was now, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel lost. You're welcome, Elias said quietly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Sharel smiled in return, a look of gratitude and understanding in her eyes. This is only the beginning. We have much to rebuild, but we will do it together. Elias turned back to the harmonizer, his mind still racing, trying to grasp the magnitude of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. He had found his place in the universe. He wasn't just a commander or a random human lost in space. He was the stellar bond, the link between worlds, and he had helped save Zephyra. And somewhere, deep inside him, Elias knew that this was just the beginning of his journey. The moment the harmonizer's light dimmed, a deep, resonating hum filled the tower, vibrating through the very bones of the ancient structure. Elias could feel the air shift around him, lighter, more stable, as if the fractured fabric of time and space was slowly stitching itself back together. The chaos that had once twisted the land of Zephyra into an unrecognizable mess now seemed to calm, its tension releasing like a held breath. The world had, in some strange way, started to heal. Elias stood motionless, his hand still resting on the harmonizer's surface, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His heart was racing, still pulsing with the aftershocks of the energy that had surged through him. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still standing on Zephyra or somewhere else entirely. The power of the harmonizer had been overwhelming, its effects rippling across his very being, unlocking something deep inside him. Behind him, Sharelle approached, her steps measured but filled with quiet awe. Her eyes, bright as the stars, never left the harmonizer. She knew what this meant. They had done it. They had succeeded. Zephyra had been saved. "You've done it," Sharelle said, her voice softer than usual, filled with a sense of reverence. "The Hollow Star's hold is broken." Elias turned toward her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and exhaustion. "Is it really over? I mean, it feels like we've just been through a storm, and I'm not sure if I'm standing in the wreckage or in the calm after it." Sharelle smiled, but there was a trace of sadness in her gaze. "The storm has passed, but the work is not yet done. We've stopped the Hollow Star's influence on Zephyra, but its damage still lingers. There are still ripples in time, fractures that need mending." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The Hollow Star had not just been a cosmic entity. It had been a force that corrupted everything in its path. The damage it had caused was not just physical. The very fabric of reality had been twisted and warped, and while the worst of it was over, the aftermath still needed to be faced. "The Hollow Star," Elias murmured, his mind still trying to grasp the true nature of the force they had just defeated. Was it ever really alive? I mean, how does something like that even exist? Sharelle's expression grew distant, her silver eyes narrowing as if she were looking far beyond the walls of the tower. "The Hollow Star is an ancient parasite, born from a collapsed reality, a singularity of darkness and destruction. It exists beyond time, beyond life as we know it. It consumes worlds, feeds on the very essence of existence, and leaves nothing behind but emptiness. It is not alive in the way you understand, but it has a will, a hunger." Elias felt a chill creep up his spine at the thought. "So we were just a blip on its radar, then? Zephyra was just another world to feed on?" Sharelle's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not just a blip. You stopped it. And in doing so, you've given us something we've been lacking for centuries. Hope. Hope that we can rebuild, that we can heal." Elias looked out over the ruins of Virilin, now bathed in the soft light of Zephyra's twin moons. The once broken city was beginning to look different, less like a ghost of the past and more like the seed of something new, something reborn. The damage still lingered, but the sense of decay and corruption had lifted. Hope, Elias whispered, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He wasn't sure he'd ever really believed in hope before, not in the way that Sharel did. But now, standing here, watching the ruins begin to heal, he felt it. It wasn't just some abstract idea. It was real. For the first time since he had crash-landed on Zephyra, Elias felt like he wasn't alone. There were people here, people who had seen the worst, who had fought and endured, and now they had something to fight for, something to rebuild. "We still have work to do," Sharel said, breaking the silence. "But we can begin, together." Elias nodded, his resolve strengthening. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But they had done it. They had stopped the hollow star, and the worst of its damage had been undone. Now it was time to rebuild, to heal, to move forward. Sharel turned toward him, her eyes filled with something deeper than just gratitude. "I never believed in the prophecy fully. I knew you were the one, the stellar bond. But I wasn't sure how it would unfold. I wasn't sure you'd be ready. But now I see that you are more than I could have ever imagined." Elias raised an eyebrow, his grin growing wider. "More than you imagined, huh? Guess that's one way of putting it. I thought I was just a guy who crashed on the wrong planet, but I've got to say, saving the galaxy has a nice ring to it." Sharel chuckled softly, her smile more genuine than ever. "Yes, you've been more than just a crash landing. You've brought us something even more precious than time itself: hope, connection, and the courage to face what comes next." Elias's expression grew more serious as he met her gaze. "You said there's more to do. What happens next?" Sharel's gaze turned to the horizon, the fractured skies of Zephyra slowly beginning to mend. "Next, we rebuild. We heal the fractures in time, restore what has been lost, and ensure that the hollow star's influence never touches this world again." Elias's heart raced with the realization that the path ahead would still be fraught with challenges, but he wasn't afraid anymore. He had come this far, and he wasn't going to stop now. The journey was far from over, but this time he wasn't just following the prophecy. He was part of it. He turned back to Sharel, a sense of purpose growing inside him. "Then let's rebuild, together." As they stood there, side by side, watching the world begin to heal, Elias realized something else. This world, this strange, beautiful planet, had become his home. He wasn't just the stellar bond anymore. He was a part of Zephyra, and together they would face whatever came next. The ruins of Virulin stretched out before them, half buried beneath a shimmer of dust and terse age. But for the first time in centuries, there was a palpable sense of life in the air. The cosmic scars left by the hollow star's corruption had begun to heal, and as the stars above flickered in their ancient patterns, there was something new about the way the world breathed. Elias stood at the edge of what had once been the center of Zephyra's greatest city. The Tower of Virulin loomed behind him, now silent but powerful, its fractured walls still carrying the whispers of a time before the darkness had descended. The winds of change were blowing across Zephyra, soft yet insistent, like the first stirrings of a new dawn. "Do you see it?" Sharel's voice broke through the quiet. She stood beside him, her eyes watching the landscape with a thoughtful gaze. "The world is shifting. What was broken is beginning to mend." Elias nodded, though he wasn't sure if he was seeing what she saw. For him, it was still a blur, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the distant echo of something far greater than what he could comprehend. But he understood the significance. The future of Zephyra had changed in ways he could never have imagined. And somehow, that change had started with him. He had come here as an outsider, an accidental traveler lost in the vastness of space. But now he had found something more. Zephyra wasn't just a mission, it was a calling. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was moving toward something. A purpose, a future. "We've done it," Elias said, his voice low, though it was filled with a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "The hollow stars gone. The fracture is healed." Sharel smiled, but it was a smile tinged with the wisdom of someone who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. "The hollow star's influence is gone, yes, but the world still needs to heal, and so do its people." Elias turned to her, meeting her gaze with a newfound clarity. "What happens now? What's our next step?" "The path ahead is not simple, Elias," she said softly. "Though we have stopped the hollow star, there are still the remnants of its damage to deal with. Fragments of time and space that must be restored. The corruption runs deep, but I have seen the way forward now, and I know that we can rebuild. Together." There was something in her tone that suggested this was just the beginning. The prophecy may have been fulfilled, but Zephyra's future wasn't set in stone. It was still a work in progress, and Elias was a part of that work. "The hollow star wasn't just a cosmic parasite," Elias said, his voice thoughtful. "It was a distortion of reality, of time itself. And now, we're left with its consequences. The people here, they've lived with this brokenness for so long. How do we fix it?" Sharel looked at him, her eyes full of understanding. "We fix it through connection, through trust. The harmonizer did more than heal the fractures of space and time. It showed us how to face our fears and our past, how to unite against the darkness." "Is that it, then?" Elias asked, a trace of uncertainty in his voice. "We just unite?" "Yes," Sharel replied, the certainty in her tone unwavering. "But it's more than just uniting. It's about understanding, embracing each other's differences, and seeing what makes us strong. We were never meant to exist in isolation. We must build relationships, not just between our people, but between our worlds, across the stars." Elias felt a weight settle in his chest at her words. She was right. The hollow star had been a force of destruction, yes, but it had also been a catalyst for something else, something greater. It had forced them to confront the darkness within themselves, and now they had the chance to rebuild, to forge new connections, to rebuild everything. "Where do we begin?" Elias asked, his voice steady now, filled with a new sense of purpose. Sharel smiled, her expression glowing with quiet pride. "We begin by rebuilding the heart of Zephyra, Virilin. It will be a symbol of our unity. The harmonizer has shown us the way forward. We must use its power to restore the streams of time, heal the land, and build the future. But we do not do this alone. We reach out to the stars. We unite with those who have been watching, waiting. There are other worlds out there, Elias. Other civilizations. We must make contact. We must understand what we share, not just what divides us." The enormity of her words hit Elias like a tidal wave. He had come to Zephyra not knowing what to expect, but now he saw the full scale of what was before them. They weren't just saving a world. They were opening a door to something far greater. A network of civilizations that could work together, learn from one another, and face the unknown together. "This is more than just fixing a planet," Elias said slowly. "It's about creating a new future. A future of connection." "Exactly," Sharel said, her voice soft with emotion. "A future built on empathy, trust, and understanding. The hollow star was just the beginning. There is more waiting for us out there, much more. Elias looked out over the ruins of Virulin once more, the broken city now bathed in the soft light of dawn. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, and there would be sacrifices. But the path was clear now. They were no longer fighting against an ancient parasite. They were fighting for something far greater. A future. For the first time since his crash, Elias felt that strange, overwhelming feeling of purpose settle in his chest. He had never imagined that a simple crash landing could lead him here, to this moment. But here he was, standing side by side with an alien queen, ready to rebuild a world. And beyond Zephyra, beyond even this planet, there was a whole universe to explore, to unite, a future where connection, not destruction, would be the foundation of everything. "I'm in," Elias said, his voice steady now, filled with resolve. "I'm ready to do this." Sharel smiled, a smile full of knowing and quiet pride. "I knew you would be. Together, we will rebuild." As they stood there, side by side, the stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter, their light no longer cold or distant, but full of promise. The journey had only just begun. The ruins of Virulin stretched before Elias, their jagged edges and crumbling walls now softened by the rising dawn. The city, once the heart of Zephyra's grandeur, now stood as a testament to both destruction and renewal. The hollow star's influence, which had plagued the land and twisted the very fabric of time and space, had been undone. But even as the world began to heal, Elias knew the journey wasn't over. The hardest part was yet to come. He stood at the edge of what had once been a thriving city center, now overgrown with strange, luminous plants that slowly began to bloom in the aftermath of the cosmic storm. The gentle winds of change whispered through the air, and Elias felt a deep, resonant pull in his chest, a call to rebuild. He wasn't just a passenger in this world anymore. He was part of its future, part of its recovery. Zephyra had a chance again, and Elias had a role to play in shaping what came next. Sharel stood beside him, her figure framed against the lightening sky. Her eyes were focused on the distant horizon, where the twin moons of Zephyra hovered like silent sentinels, casting their pale glow across the land. "You can feel it, can't you?" she asked softly, breaking the stillness between them. Elias nodded, taking in the sight of the recovering city. There was something undeniably hopeful in the air, though it was faint, like the first flicker of light after a storm. "Yeah," he murmured. "The world's holding its breath, waiting to see what comes next." Sharel's gaze never wavered, her voice calm, but filled with an underlying weight. "We've stopped the hollow star's influence on Zephyra, but that is only the beginning. We've broken the surface of something far greater." Elias turned to her, sensing the depth in her words. "You mean—" "Yes," Sharel said, her eyes glimmering with a distant understanding. "The universe is vast. We were never meant to be isolated. The worlds beyond Zephyra, the ones that have watched us from afar, now is the time to reach out, to connect." The gravity of her statement hung in the air between them. Elias had never considered the possibility that Zephyra was only a small part of a greater whole. The universe, so vast and unknown, now felt like a network of endless possibilities, civilizations waiting to be discovered, alliances to be formed. "Other civilizations?" Elias echoed, a flicker of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I guess I never really thought beyond Zephyra." "Most people don't," Sharel replied, her tone gentle. Zephyra was once part of a greater network of worlds, an alliance of civilizations that spanned across the stars. But the hollow star's arrival shattered that network. Now we must rebuild it, together. The weight of her words settled deep in Elias's chest. Rebuilding Zephyra wasn't just about restoring the planet. It was about reconnecting with the stars, mending the fabric of relationships that had been torn apart by time and tragedy. This wasn't just a planet on the brink of destruction anymore. This was a chance to restore the entire intergalactic web of existence. "Where do we even start?" Elias asked, feeling the enormity of the task ahead. "By reaching out," Sharel said. "The Harmonizer has opened a pathway. Its technology has shown us the way forward. There are worlds out there, worlds that have been isolated just like Zephyra. We will begin by reaching out to them. The first steps will be slow, but they will be steady." Elias's mind raced. The idea of making contact with other civilizations was intimidating. What if they weren't ready? What if they weren't willing to work together? There were so many unknowns. Sharel seemed to sense his hesitation. "This isn't something that will happen overnight," she said. "We will face challenges, but we've already overcome the greatest one. The hollow star is no more. What's left to fear?" Elias exhaled slowly, letting her words sink in. She was right. The hollow star had been a cosmic nightmare, an entity of darkness and destruction that had nearly consumed Zephyra. But now that threat was gone. They had survived the impossible. What was left now was to rebuild, to restore, to reconnect. "I get it," Elias said, his voice steady, the uncertainty fading away. "It's time to rebuild. Not just Zephyra, but the whole damn galaxy." Sharel smiled, a glimmer of pride in her eyes. "Yes. And it starts with us, Elias. We've already taken the first step. The universe is waiting for us to take the next." As the first rays of dawn bathed Zephyra's recovering city in golden light, Elias knew that everything had changed. The battle against the hollow star might have been won, but that was only one chapter in a much larger story. He wasn't just a commander now. He was part of something far bigger. A link between Zephyra and the stars, a bridge between civilizations. The task ahead was daunting, but Elias was no longer afraid. He had faced the impossible and come out on the other side. Now he had a new purpose, to help rebuild not just a world, but an entire universe. Days turned into weeks, and soon the diplomatic efforts began to take shape. The once broken communication channels that had been dormant for centuries were slowly coming back to life. Elias found himself in the heart of it all, standing at the intersection of past and future. With Sharel by his side, he began to navigate the delicate process of reaching out to other civilizations. They had made contact with the Zara, energy beings from the outer nebulae, whose cities existed in the most hostile environments known to man. The Draknar, a militaristic species, had shown interest in alliances, and even the peaceful Valorian colonies were eager to assist in the restoration efforts. The more Elias worked with Sharel, the more he realized that this was no longer just about saving Zephyra. It was about forging connections, sharing knowledge, and building a future where the galaxy stood united against whatever threats may arise. One evening, as Elias sat in the communication hub, a holographic image flickered to life in front of him. It was a Draknar representative, tall and imposing, its armor shimmering in the dim light. "We have received your message, human." The Draknar's voice was low, resonant, and filled with authority. "We are willing to assist you, but know this, we do not give our aid freely. Elias leaned forward, his fingers brushing the console. What are the terms? The Draknar's eyes flickered with an unreadable expression. We require knowledge. Your species possesses technology, knowledge that can benefit us. We want access to the Harmonizer's secrets. Elias hesitated. This wasn't an easy request. The Harmonizer's power was still not fully understood, and some of its capabilities were far too dangerous to share. We'll share what we can, Elias said cautiously. But some things must remain protected. The future of our worlds depends on our ability to control this technology. The Draknar's gaze softened ever so slightly. Agreed. But know this. Alliances are not forged in a single moment. They are built piece by piece, over time. Do not let mistrust divide us. The screen flickered as the image disappeared, and Elias leaned back in his chair. The road ahead would be full of negotiations, compromises, and difficult decisions, but they were on the right path. This was just the beginning. Standing at the window, staring at the stars above, Elias realized that his life had changed forever. He wasn't just a man who had crashed on a strange world. He was part of something much bigger. A future where worlds were no longer divided, but united. Zephyra had been saved, but the galaxy was just beginning to open up.